All right, so let's start off, James and Brad. I wanted to kind of just ask you guys, like, what was your primary question with this publication?
I think what we were trying to do is create a little bit of a summary or an overview of what people have been doing in this area, where this area meaning sort of the online, non-traditional or kind of internet-based tools that people are using to get news about their research out. So, thinking not just about what we normally think about in terms of publications and journals, but trying to sort of survey the landscape about what people are doing online, social media, blogs, all that kind of stuff, and trying to build sort of like a conceptual map and understand the landscape a little bit better. And our target audience is really, I think, mostly researchers or people who are generating the knowledge and trying to give them a sense of what's going on out there online, which I think was we thought was lacking in terms of like a sort of like a good landscape of what's happening in emergency medicine. And then we chose emergency medicine rather than just PEM, just because there's kind of more stuff in EM, and so we thought it was important to be as broad as we could. Brad, you have anything to add to that?
Nope, that was perfect.
Yeah, I think the question of why is really helpful. Like, what made you kind of want to approach this?
What made me ask James to go through with the study? No, right? Because I think at a certain point, this is a blogging, podcasting, social media, all of it is a more mature platform. But really, how you could use it to teach has been described. How you could use it to build curricula, especially within emergency medicine, has been described. But how we use it as part of the package to disseminate research and new knowledge wasn't. And so the goal was to develop this framework to derive some themes. And then if you look at an individual dissemination campaign, use those themes as kind of the pillars, as the tent poles that you build your strategy around. We'll mention some of the themes in a little bit. I'll give you a brief concrete example. And we thought a scoping review made the most sense methodologically, because it's, they've done, qualitative work, they've done mixed method studies, they've done some Delphi, but this was a largely undefined area. And so a scoping review is a version of a systematic review. There are Prisma guidelines, and so there's a defined methodology. And James did a tremendous job working with a medical librarian in querying the data, setting up a review database, and then deriving a strategy so that we could review both abstracts and full text articles for inclusion in the study.
I don't want to turn this into like a heavy methods expenditure on scoping reviews, but James, any like top 3 points about the process of a scoping review, or things that you didn't know about it as a method before we move on to what you found?
Yeah, I think it is sort of like it is a systematic review in the sense that your search is planned. You should pre-publish your strategy and your queries and your methods. And there is Prisma guidelines about it, so you can search Prisma scoping review guidelines. That said, it's a flexible kind of framework, in the sense that we knew we weren't going to find a bunch of quantitative data that we could analyze per se. So we needed some sort of like a way to review the articles that we could actually discuss in sort of more of a qualitative way. I think the big things is like these things just take a huge amount of time and effort. Like if you do this right and you follow the checklist and you're very deliberate and you pre-publish your queries and all that kind of stuff, it just takes a lot of time. And then if you're doing this right, the value of having a librarian help you structure the queries and talk about which databases you should search and how you should search them and the differences between them. All that stuff is really important. And then just being very deliberate ahead of time about how you're going to collect your data and store it so that you have everything available for, because you should have multiple reviewers for each article and for each abstract. So figuring out how to do that in a way that is consistent and that reliable and that you can, follow over time and not get lost, because it just takes a long time.
Okay, so what did you guys find? What are the major pillars that we should be looking at?
All right, I'll just tell you briefly kind of like what the things that we found, and then I'll let Brad talk a little bit about the specific example that he had. So what we did is we took all these articles, we read them all. There were 5 of us reading them. And then we kind of, after we read them and did answer some structured questions about them, we built sort of like a set of major domains that we thought all of these articles fell into. And so, the first domain,
I think I'm going to
Lynn, can you mute yourself? Thanks, Lynn.
go to IKEA.
Oh,
Are they going to IKEA?
all right. They're going to IKEA. We're all going to
Lynn, you want to mute yourself? That would be really good.
Yeah.
She is.
Get a
She's
Stromsblarg. It's a chair.
So, we found these. So we basically tried to do sort of like a little bit of a qualitative look at how we would classify these papers into different buckets. So we kind of found buckets that fit most of these papers, and we decided there were about 6 of them. One is really like the integration with what we call traditional knowledge sources, so like journals and stuff like that, where the way that they're kind of approaching this, because we're seeing more and more of that. People like JAMA and New England Journal are investing more into this kind of work. So that was one domain. Another one, it was online organizations and communities of practice. So if you look at, there was sort of a lot of papers actually about Trek, and I think that was a good sort of model for how you can try and build a community of practice. So there were a few papers about communities of practice that we thought were helpful. So so that was one bucket. We saw a lot of papers in there. And then there's been a lot of concern about quality in terms of like, are these online sources good? And so there's a whole group of people that have been working on quality and assessment tools. So that was kind of a bucket of papers that we found too. And then another one was just about sort of the quantitative piece of this, sort of like, where are we in the development of measures for how successful these things are, or how many eyeballs we're getting at, and that kind of stuff. And then as Brad alluded to earlier, there's sort of a lot about like, a lot of online stuff is truly education and less dissemination. It gets blurry, but I think what we mean by that is that, dissemination is like, here is a piece of research knowledge, instead of education being like, here's how you might approach abdominal pain. And so we did find a few articles that seemed to cross both things, and we thought were important enough about dissemination to include, and also included a few articles about how this kind of work should be in promotion and tenure committee thoughts and stuff like that. So we thought that was important to include as well. And then the final thing, this was a lot of sort of like review and subjective editorial type pieces, but just sort of like the people writing about how great this is and the people writing about how not great this is, and sort of what the potential barriers, and then also how useful this can be. So those are kind of the 6 domains that we found and that were seem to apply to most of the articles that we came across.
So in a very deliberate fashion, so I'm taking these 6 domains, and this is through AAP section on emergency medicine, but we're working on a dissemination campaign for choosing wisely, which is a great set of rules to don't do things that you shouldn't do, like x-rays for not pooping and $1,600 viral swabs for snot. And disseminating that information broadly, I'm using these domains as a framework to kind of build our strategy with the choosing wisely folks. So this is knowledge that's already published. And so systematically integrating it, the online activities, that's going to be videos, it's going to be blog articles, and it's going to be social media, integrate it with the already published materials. We're going to leverage the reach of communities of practice. So I'm partnering with Don't Forget the Bubbles, who gets 1 million site views a year. Right, very well read Australian and English collaborative, using the metric quality assessment tools to make sure that the materials are high quality for pre and post publication review. There are ways built into the Choosing Wisely website that we can measure and monitor traffic. It's not altmetric, but it's a Google suite, and it's very similar in looking at reach and clickbacks and ways that lead back to this primary material. And then professional development. So being very intentional about giving other people an opportunity to contribute to this content. That could be junior faculty, that could be URM medical graduates, right? That could be non-physicians, and finding a way to not just have it be, Brad or Jason who writes something, but really looking for other voices. And so that strategy, even before we started publishing anything, which we're going to work on in this coming year, those were the tent poles. Those were the pillars that we're building this dissemination strategy around. And that's how I pitched it to the Choosing Wisely folks.
So you've already started to touch on this a little bit, but just to call it out, what do we do with this information? So you sort of told me what you found, and I am just wondering some practical tips on application.
Mm-hmm. James, you want to jump in first and then I'll follow up?
Sure. I think, a couple big takeaways that are in our paper, but also in general, is that I think we probably reached like peak blog, like we're seeing this is still very decentralized, but we're seeing more centralization around, there's a few sources out there that are doing a lot of online stuff. So I think one thing we were trying to say is like, don't try and reinvent the wheel. Use what we have here to help you figure out who your target audience is and what the avenues might be. And then try and connect with what's already out there. And then I think another big thing is this is happening. Like it's happening. People are going to the internet and they're finding things out about your research usually. And if that's probably something that you should have a say in. So investment in this is important. I think if you're publishing, what you think is practice changing stuff, then you should add your voice to the online conversation in some way. And I think it's a little unclear exactly how to do that just yet. But I think, like Brad said, if you use this, what we have here as sort of tent poles to help you figure out how to do it, then you might be able to kind of get people to do, or at least put out there the voice that you want to be out there.
Right. If you know that,
go ahead, Brad.
Yeah.
One final thing is just that we don't know if this works. And so there's a ton of work to be done in the quantitative aspect of this. Like, how do we measure not just eyeballs, but any kind of, any kind of patient outcomes? Because to be clear, that doesn't exist. And we write that in the paper. Like nobody knows whether this actually helps patients or not. But it's happening. And so if you want to be a part of this, which probably you should, then you got to get your voice out there. And, I think we provide a little bit of a background to help people understand what's out there and how you might approach it. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A concrete example would be if you know that a piece of your work requires patient and family education for dissemination, then you look for somebody that has a built-in audience. So you go to Mike Patrick, right? He does a very well listened to patient and family focused online podcast, and he's got tons and tons of listeners and has built-in infrastructure. So he can be a dissemination channel. What if you have to reach patients that English is not their primary language, or caregivers it's not their primary language? There might just be someone in Colorado who does just that. And so Pediatra Linea is a Spanish language podcast, and knowing who all of these sources are in the beginning should be very intentional. So don't wait for them to pick it up and do it. Ask them ahead of time. That's what we did with a pain podcast season through EMSC. It was kind of our beta version. We asked people ahead of time and said, here, we're going to do 5 podcasts in pain. You all have built-in audiences. Let's put this together as a mini season. And you develop the learning objectives ahead of time. So it's more proactive than reactive.